Number 10. The Secret Burial of Gilgamesh. Some lost burials are mysterious because the evidence is thin. Others are mysterious because the dead themselves stand so close to the border of myth that even asking where they were buried feels like stepping into a half-lit world between literature and history. The Secret Burial of Gilgamesh belongs to that second category. Gilgamesh survives as one of the oldest and most powerful figures in human storytelling, a king of Uruk transformed by epic tradition into something larger than ordinary kingship. That alone makes the question of his burial deeply unsettling. If there was ever a real ruler beneath the legend, where did he go? And if he was buried with the honors of a king whose memory became immortal, what kind of tomb would a civilization have built for someone already moving toward myth? That is what gives this case such strange force. Gilgamesh is not simply a lost monarch from a poorly documented age. He is a figure whose story is saturated with death, the fear of oblivion, and the desperate search for lasting memory. In the epic, he confronts mortality directly and emerges haunted by the truth that even kings die. That means any speculation about his burial carries symbolic weight far beyond archaeology. To search for the grave of Gilgamesh is almost to ask whether the first great literary meditation on death left behind a real body somewhere beneath Mesopotamian earth. The idea feels less like a normal excavation problem and more like a challenge thrown across thousands of years. Part of the mystery comes from the way ancient Mesopotamia itself survives through fragments, tablets, royal lists, ruined cities, and river-shifted landscapes that have been buried, eroded, and transformed again and again. Uruk was real. Its kingship was real. But the deeper one reaches into the earliest layers of remembered rulers, the more difficult it becomes to separate historical possibility from the monumentalizing force of later tradition. Gilgamesh may preserve the memory of a genuine early ruler, but the burial place of that ruler, if it ever existed in a recoverable form, has been swallowed by time, geography, and the symbolic enlargement that turned him into one of humanity's oldest giants of memory. What makes this especially fitting for the list is the idea of secrecy itself. Some later traditions and archaeological suggestions have stirred speculation that elite burials in ancient Mesopotamia could be placed in sacred or hidden contexts tied to water, temple space, or royal enclosure. Whether any such model applies directly to Gilgamesh is uncertain, but uncertainty is exactly what deepens the aura. A king whose literary afterlife became inseparable from mortality and divine distance feels like someone who should be hidden. The absence of a confirmed burial does not weaken the legend. It strengthens it. The body disappears, and in disappearing, becomes even harder to separate from the myth. And that is why the Secret Burial of Gilgamesh takes the number 10 spot. It is not only a missing tomb, it is a missing tomb attached to one of the earliest figures ever to stand at the center of humanity's confrontation with death. If his grave existed, it belonged to a king. If it is lost, it belongs to legend. And because no one can fully account for where the historical and the epic finally part ways, the burial of Gilgamesh remains one of the most haunting absences in ancient memory. Number 9. The vanished resting place of Imhotep. Some lost tombs are attached to rulers and conquerors. Others become mysterious because the dead person seems almost too extraordinary to vanish. The vanished resting place of Imhotep belongs to that second category. Imhotep was not a pharaoh, yet his afterlife in memory grew so immense that he became something close to sacred brilliance embodied. Architect, polymath, advisor to Djoser, and later revered almost as a divine figure of wisdom and healing, he stands among the most astonishing personalities of ancient Egypt. That is what makes the disappearance of his burial so strange. How does a man famous enough to reshape royal architecture and later be venerated across centuries vanish so completely into the archaeological dark? That is what gives this case its special unease. Imhotep helped create permanence. The step pyramid at Saqqara, is one of the defining achievements of ancient monumental culture, a statement in stone that death could be organized, elevated, and turned into enduring royal memory. A figure so central to that architectural revolution feels like someone whose own burial should be grandly traceable. And yet the resting place of the man associated with one of history's first great stone funerary complexes remains uncertain. The irony is almost too perfect. The builder of immortality disappears within the very civilization that perfected the art of monumental remembrance. Part of the mystery lies in Egypt itself, where tombs were built to survive eternity and yet have been looted, buried, erased, shifted, dismantled, and absorbed into landscapes layered over by millennia of devotion, reuse, destruction, and rediscovery. Imhotep's stature changed across time as well. He began as a historical official of the Third Dynasty, but later ages elevated him into a figure of cultic importance. That transformation complicates everything. Once a historical man becomes an object of veneration, later memory can reshape the meaning of his death, the possible movement of his remains, and the way people imagine his burial. The tomb ceases to be just a grave. It becomes a site of almost sacred expectation. What makes Imhotep especially compelling for this list is that his missing burial feels like a paradox produced by his own greatness. Lesser officials have known tombs. Forgotten nobles have walls and inscriptions. Yet Imhotep, whose name outlived dynasties, remains strangely unanchored in death. That creates the sense that perhaps his burial lies somewhere still hidden in Saqqara or nearby, sealed beneath layers of debris and lost architecture, or perhaps that the burial history attached to him became too complex to preserve clearly once reverence, myth, and changing cult practice took hold. In either case, the absence begins to feel meaningful. The more important the dead man becomes, the more intolerable and fascinating it is that his body has slipped free of record, and that is why the vanished resting place of Imhotep takes the number 9 spot. It is one of those rare burial mysteries where the missing tomb feels almost like an insult to historical logic itself. A civilization obsessed with the preservation of names and the housing of the dead should have kept hold of a figure like him. Yet it did not, or at least not in any way we can securely recover. What remains is one of ancient Egypt's most elegant absences, the lost grave of the man who helped teach stone how to remember. Number 8. The grave of King Arthur. Some lost burials are mysterious because history failed to preserve them. Others are mysterious because the dead person may already belong to that unstable border where history, propaganda, and legend have fused so tightly that the grave itself becomes almost impossible to pin down. The grave of King Arthur belongs to that second category. Few figures in Western tradition have generated more longing, argument, and symbolic need than Arthur. Warrior king, defender of Britain, doomed ruler, returning hero, or literary construct built from many older memories, he has been claimed by chronicle, romance, nationalism, and myth alike. That alone makes the question of his burial deeply charged. If Arthur was real, where is he? And if he was buried, why has the grave never settled the matter? That is what gives the case its extraordinary force. Arthur is not simply a missing king. He is a missing center of cultural imagination. The search for his grave has never been about bones alone. It has always been about legitimacy, origins, and the possibility of proving that a figure who reshaped the medieval imagination actually stood within recoverable history. In that sense, the burial becomes more than an archaeological mystery. It becomes a test. If found, it might seem to anchor legend in earth. If never found, it leaves Arthur suspended where he has always been most powerful, neither fully historical nor fully unreal, but haunting the space between. The most famous complication, of course, is Glastonbury. Medieval claims that Arthur's grave was discovered there gave the story one of its most famous resting places, yet that very claim deepens rather than resolves the mystery. The discovery came in a political and cultural context where Arthur mattered enormously, and where institutions had reasons to benefit from the presence of such a tomb. That does not mean every element must be dismissed outright, but it does mean the grave enters history already wrapped in suspicion. Was this preservation, invention, opportunism, or some unstable mixture of all three? Once a burial site becomes entangled with need, belief, and prestige, certainty begins to retreat. What makes Arthur especially fitting for this list is that the lost grave serves the legend better than a confirmed one ever could. A fixed tomb would close the story. An unfixed one keeps it open. Arthur can remain the king beneath the hill, the absent ruler not fully dead, the buried sovereign whose return is always possible because his resting place was never securely contained. This is one of the deepest patterns in heroic memory. Truly symbolic rulers are often hardest to bury. Either their tomb disappears, or it becomes contested enough that the body never fully settles into the past. The grave becomes part of the mythology of return, and that is why the grave of King Arthur takes the number 8 spot. It is not just a missing burial, it is one of the clearest examples of how a culture can need a dead ruler too much to let him rest in one unambiguous place. Whether Arthur was a historical war leader magnified by later tradition or a legend assembled from many fragments, the uncertainty around his grave has become part of his power. The body is unaccounted for, and because it is unaccounted for, the king never fully leaves history. Number 7. The lost burial of Attila the Hun. Some lost tombs are surrounded by reverence, others are surrounded by fear. The lost burial of Attila the Hun belongs to that second category. Attila survives in memory as one of the most dreaded figures of late antiquity, a conqueror whose name became almost synonymous with devastation in the Roman imagination. That alone would make his burial mysterious. But what elevates the case into legend is the tradition that after his death, he was buried in secret with such care that the location would be protected forever. In some versions, treasure, ritual concealment, and even the killing of those involved ensured that the grave would disappear with the moment of burial itself. Whether every detail is historically exact matters less than the logic behind it. A man feared in life was not meant to become vulnerable in death. That is what makes Attila's missing grave so haunting. His burial is imagined not as a public monument, but as a strategic act of disappearance. This is profoundly fitting for a figure who spent his career moving through frontiers, terrifying empires, and making instability part of his power. A visible imperial mausoleum would almost feel wrong for him. Instead, the legend gives us secrecy, speed, concealment, and erased witnesses. The result is a burial that mirrors conquest itself, sudden, violent, and impossible to control from the outside. The grave does not invite posterity in, it shuts posterity out. The setting deepens the mystery even more. Attila's world was one of shifting steppe routes, riverlands, migrations, and political formations far less architecturally stable than the great stone tomb cultures people often imagine first. That makes archaeological recovery extraordinarily difficult, and it also gives the legend room to expand. A ruler buried somewhere in a landscape of movement and transformation is easier to lose than one sealed inside a monumental complex in a fixed ceremonial capital. Rivers change course, camps vanish, frontiers dissolve, empires that feared him crumble or change. Over time, the absence of the grave starts to feel almost natural, as if the land itself chose not to keep him in one place. What makes Attila especially compelling for this list is the symbolic relationship between hidden burial and political terror. The conqueror who frightened Rome and helped darken the imagination of an age does not end beneath an open shrine where pilgrims can gather. He disappears. That disappearance matters because it protects the legend from domestication. A visible grave would turn him into a dead ruler among others. A missing grave keeps him more dangerous. He remains the scourge, the rider from the margins, the invader whose last location is withheld from history just as his movements once seemed to defy the map. and that is why the lost burial of Attila the Hun takes the number 7 spot. It is one of those burial mysteries where secrecy itself is the story. The grave is missing not despite his legend, but because of it. Whether hidden beneath earth no one can now identify, lost to river and time, or magnified by later storytelling into something even darker, Attila's burial remains one of history's most fitting disappearances. A man who once made civilizations fear his arrival left behind a death the record still cannot securely catch. Number 6. The Unfound Tomb of Boudica. Some lost burials are mysterious because the dead were hidden with ritual care. Others are mysterious because the person died in the aftermath of catastrophe, leaving history with a powerful name but no secure resting place. The Unfound Tomb of Boudica belongs to that second category. The warrior queen of the Iceni survives in memory as one of the most explosive figures in Roman Britain, a ruler whose revolt turned grief, humiliation, and anti-imperial fury into one of the most famous uprisings in ancient history. That alone makes the absence of her grave deeply unsettling. A queen who burned herself into the record with such force should feel archaeologically present. And yet she remains, in death as in legend, frustratingly out of reach. That is what gives this case its haunting quality. Boudica is not remembered as a quiet tribal ruler who disappeared into obscurity. She is remembered as fire, motion, and revenge, a queen whose war shook Roman confidence and then vanished into defeat, uncertainty, and myth. The sources do not preserve her end with the clarity one might expect for such a towering figure. We are left with broad tradition, possible suicide or illness, and the lingering assumption that she was buried somewhere in Britain without any surviving monument that modern archaeology can securely claim. Once that happens, the burial becomes part of the larger tragedy. The queen who rose in open defiance disappears back into the land. The setting matters enormously. Roman Britain was a world of roads, forts, towns, and campaigns, but also one of tribal territories, local sacred spaces, and burial practices that do not always leave behind the kind of monumental certainty later ages prefer. If Boudica was buried quickly, ritually, secretly, or under conditions of political defeat, the chances of a clearly identifiable tomb were always slim. And because her memory would later expand far beyond her own moment, becoming a symbol of resistance, nationhood, and female ferocity, the absence of a grave only deepened the legend. The land kept her, but would not yield her back. What makes Boudica especially fitting for this list is that her missing burial feels emotionally right, even while it remains historically frustrating. A grand identified tomb might actually diminish part of her mythic power. Boudica belongs to roads, battlefields, burning towns, and the haunted memory of revolt. Once a figure becomes that symbolically charged, a lost grave starts to feel like an extension of the story rather than a failure of it. She is not neatly housed in death. She is diffused into the island she rose to defend. That is why so many speculative locations, from mounds to urban legends beneath modern London, continue to attract attention. People want the queen anchored, but legend keeps pushing her back into mist. And that is why the Unfound Tomb of Boudica takes the number 6 spot. It is one of those burial mysteries where absence itself becomes part of the queen's afterlife. No confirmed grave, no secure monument, no final chamber settles the matter. What remains instead is a ruler who erupted against empire and then slipped into one of the most compelling silences in British historical memory. Boudica's body was lost, but the force of her name only grew. In some ways, that is exactly what makes her burial feel so impossible to find. The queen was absorbed by legend before history could properly bury her. Number 5. The Missing Remains of Nefertiti. Some lost burials are attached to conquerors and warriors. Others are attached to faces so iconic that their disappearance feels almost impossible. The Missing Remains of Nefertiti belong to that second category. Few figures from ancient Egypt have survived into modern imagination with the same strange intensity. Queen, royal partner, symbol of beauty, participant in one of the most radical religious transformations of the ancient world, Nefertiti stands at the center of a dynasty already wrapped in mystery. That alone would make her burial compelling. But what pushes the case into deeper darkness is that even the location of her remains, or whether they have already been found and misidentified, remains unresolved. For someone so visually unforgettable, death has been remarkably effective at hiding her. That is what makes the case so eerie. Nefertiti belongs to the Amarna world, and the Amarna world itself feels unstable in historical memory, brilliant, disruptive, and then partially erased. Akhenaten's religious revolution, the shift to Aten worship, the reconfiguration of royal art and ideology, and the later reaction against that entire experiment all created conditions under which burial history could become unusually fragile. Tombs were prepared, plans changed, rulers reinterpreted, and the official memory of the regime became politically dangerous. In such an atmosphere, it is not hard to imagine a queen's remains being moved, hidden, damaged, reburied, or folded into the burial politics of a collapsing dynastic crisis. Part of the fascination comes from the possibility that Nefertiti may not be fully absent at all. That possibility is in some ways more unsettling than simple loss. If her body survives somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, in an unrecognized chamber, under another identity, or entangled with the burial history of Tutankhamun's circle, then the mystery becomes almost intimate. She is not gone in the mythic sense. She is close, perhaps painfully close, yet still beyond secure recovery. Few historical absences create more tension than those in which the dead may be just one wall, one reanalysis, or one mistaken attribution away from revelation. What deepens the mystery further is Nefertiti's symbolic status. She is not only an ancient queen, she is a face modernity feels it knows, and that familiarity creates an almost uncanny contrast with the uncertainty surrounding her body. The famous bust gives us one of the most vivid portraits from antiquity, serene, elegant, seemingly present. But the remains of the woman herself are not securely held in the same clarity. The image survives, the body does not. That split between visual immortality and funerary disappearance is one of the strangest things about her legacy. It is as if the civilization that gave her one of history's most famous faces denied posterity the final knowledge of where that face was laid to rest, and that is why the missing remains of Nefertiti take the number 5 spot. This is not just a missing tomb, it is a missing tomb attached to one of the most recognizable women of the ancient world, in a dynasty defined by upheaval, suppression, and burial uncertainty. Nefertiti remains haunting because she is both overexposed and absent, endlessly seen and never securely buried. History remembers her features with astonishing precision, yet cannot fully account for where the queen herself finally disappeared. Number 4. The tomb of Alaric the Goth. Some lost burials are mysterious because they belong to kings of ancient splendor. Others are mysterious because they belong to the men who helped break worlds apart. The tomb of Alaric the Goth belongs to that second category. Alaric is remembered above all as the Visigothic king who sacked Rome in 410, a moment so symbolically violent that it seemed to announce the vulnerability of a civilization long imagined as eternal. That alone would make his burial compelling. But what makes it truly haunting is the tradition that after his death, he was buried in secret beneath the bed of a river, together with treasure, and that the laborers who made the burial possible were killed so the site could never be revealed. That is what gives the story its extraordinary power. A conqueror who enters Rome in history's imagination should not, one feels, lie in an ordinary grave. The legend answers that instinct with something darker and more fitting. The river is diverted. The king is buried beneath its temporary emptiness. Then the waters are allowed to return, sealing the dead beneath moving current and leaving no visible marker. Whether every detail can be accepted literally is almost beside the point. The image is too perfect to lose its hold. Alaric becomes a ruler, hidden not merely by earth, but by landscape itself, buried under a force that keeps moving and keeps history out. The symbolism matters immensely. A tomb beneath a river does not just conceal, it transforms. Rivers divide territory, erase traces, shift over time, and resist simple excavation. To imagine Alaric lying beneath one is to imagine a burial designed for permanent disappearance. It is also to imagine a conqueror folded back into the instability he embodied. Alaric's life was tied to movement, pressure on imperial borders, and the shaking of old certainties. A secret river burial mirrors that perfectly. He does not become a fixed Roman-style memory housed in stone. He becomes something more elusive, a dead king hidden under flowing silence. What makes this especially fitting for the list is the way treasure deepens the legend. Once a grave is imagined as containing not only a body but also royal wealth taken from the symbolic center of the Roman world, the burial becomes doubly charged. It is no longer just a resting place. It becomes a vault of civilizational collision, the dead king and the plunder of empire sealed together in one unreachable chamber. That combination ensures the story never goes quiet. Archaeological desire, romantic imagination, and historical symbolism all reinforce one another. The more impossible the recovery seems, the more magnetic it becomes. And that is why the tomb of Alaric the Goth takes the number 4 spot. It is one of history's most cinematic burial mysteries, a conqueror of Rome, hidden beneath a river with treasure and secrecy, so complete that the grave becomes almost mythic in its own right. Whether the exact details were preserved faithfully or enlarged by later retelling, the result is the same. Alaric's resting place remains one of those absences that feel too dramatic to be accidental. The man who helped shatter Rome's aura, left behind a death history, still cannot dig back out. Number 3. The lost grave of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Some lost burials are compelling because of political secrecy. Others are compelling because love, defeat, empire, and spectacle all converge around the dead so completely that the missing tomb begins to feel almost intolerable. The lost grave of Cleopatra and Mark Antony belongs to that second category. Few couples in ancient history have left behind such a charged afterlife. Their story stands at the intersection of Roman civil war, Egyptian royal collapse, romance, propaganda, and one of the most famous double suicides in historical memory. That alone would make their burial important. But the fact that the tomb itself remains unconfirmed pushes the entire legend into a more haunting register. 2 of antiquity's most famous dead are still not securely at rest in the record. That is what gives this case such extraordinary power. Cleopatra and Antony did not die as private individuals. They died as defeated symbols at the end of a political and civilizational struggle. Octavian's victory reshaped the Mediterranean world, and their deaths became part of the theatre through which that new order announced itself. Ancient sources suggest they were buried together, which already carries enormous emotional and symbolic force. But where? If they truly shared a tomb prepared under the shadow of conquest and final self-destruction, then that burial would mark one of the most charged funerary sites in the ancient world. Not simply a grave, but the sealed aftermath of a world-ending romance and imperial transition. The political atmosphere matters enormously. This was not a normal royal burial in a stable dynasty. Cleopatra's kingdom was ending. Antony's faction had failed. Roman power was rewriting the future at the very moment their bodies required placement among the dead. In such a situation, a burial could be honored, controlled, hidden, or made secondary to the larger needs of imperial narrative. The tomb therefore sits at the edge of multiple possibilities, preserved but lost, destroyed by time, submerged beneath later Alexandria, or hidden in a sacred context not yet recovered. Every possibility reinforces the same unsettling truth. The dead were too important, and the historical moment too unstable, for their resting place to be simple. What deepens the mystery further is Alexandria itself. The ancient city has suffered earthquake, destruction, rebuilding, submersion, and centuries of continuous occupation, all of which make the recovery of a specific high-status tomb extraordinarily difficult. This is one reason the case feels so painful to historical imagination. The grave may not be lost in some empty desert. It may be beneath a living city, beneath layers of ruin, or beneath waters that now hold parts of the ancient shoreline. That proximity creates a special kind of tension. The tomb is not comfortably gone. It may be near, perhaps even very near, but the city that once staged their grandeur has become one of the worst possible places for certainty. And that is why the lost grave of Cleopatra and Mark Antony takes the number 3 spot. This is not just a missing burial. It is a missing burial attached to one of the most famous endings in all of ancient history. A queen and a Roman triumvir, united in life, defeated in war, and perhaps buried together in death, should feel recoverable. Yet they remain hidden, suspended between text and earth, romance and ruin. Their tomb matters because it would not only tell us where 2 people were laid to rest, it would anchor one of history's greatest collapses in stone. Until then, the silence around their grave continues to feel like part of the tragedy itself. Number 2. Genghis Khan's burial site. Some lost burials are mysterious because time erased them. Others are mysterious because human beings may have erased them on purpose with such ruthless efficiency that the dead ruler seems to have won one final campaign against history itself. Genghis Khan's burial site belongs to that second category. Few figures in world history cast a shadow as vast as his. Conqueror, empire founder, destroyer of kingdoms, architect of one of the largest land empires ever assembled, Genghis Khan is remembered on a scale so immense that the absence of his grave feels almost impossible. A man who reshaped continents should, one instinctively feels, leave behind a tomb equal to his power. Instead, he vanishes. That is what makes the case so haunting. Tradition holds that after his death, his burial was concealed with extraordinary secrecy. Roots were obscured, witnesses silenced, traces destroyed, and the landscape itself allowed to swallow the event. Whether every version of the burial legend is exact hardly matters, because the logic behind them is perfectly fitting. A ruler whose strength depended in part on mobility, discipline, and the manipulation of fear does not end in a public mausoleum where enemies and admirers alike can gather. He is hidden. The grave becomes an act of protection, sovereignty, and perhaps sacred withdrawal. Even in death, access to him is denied. The geography intensifies everything. Mongolia is vast, harsh, beautiful, and capable of keeping secrets on a scale urban civilizations rarely understand. Steppe, mountain, forest, and shifting routes make concealment plausible in a way that feels almost cruelly perfect. A burial placed within such terrain and then shielded by deliberate human silence is not easily recovered by later archaeology, no matter how intense the desire. That is one reason the mystery has never faded. People do not merely wonder where Genghis Khan lies. They sense that the land itself may still be carrying out the final instruction of empire. Do not reveal him. What makes this especially fitting for the list is the emotional contradiction at the center of it. On one hand, the missing grave is frustrating because it withholds one of the most important dead in history from direct understanding. On the other hand, the secrecy enhances the legend so completely that a discovered tomb might almost feel less powerful than the absence. Genghis Khan's burial site has become one of those rare historical voids that seems to enlarge the man rather than diminish him. His empire can be traced, his campaigns can be studied, his impact can be measured, but his body remains unreachable. The founder of vast worldly dominion becomes, in death, strangely unpossessable, and that is why Genghis Khan's burial site takes the number 2 spot. It is not merely lost, it feels defended by history, geography, and the intentional will of those who buried him. Few missing graves reveal so clearly how power can survive through disappearance. The conqueror who once crossed the world left behind a death no one can securely locate, and in doing so became even larger than a monumental tomb might have allowed. The empire remained visible. The grave did not. That imbalance is exactly what makes the mystery unforgettable. Number 1. Alexander the Great's tomb. Some lost burials are famous. Others are so famous that their absence feels like one of history's greatest unfinished sentences. Alexander the Great's tomb belongs to that highest category. Few rulers have ever moved through history with such speed, ambition, and mythic intensity. By the time he died, he had shattered empires, redrawn the ancient world, and become the kind of figure later generations could hardly discuss without magnifying. That alone would make his burial important. But what pushes the mystery to the top of this list is the extraordinary fact that Alexander's tomb was not always unknown. It was once one of the most famous burial sites in the ancient world, visited, revered, and woven into imperial memory. And then somehow, it was lost. That is what makes the case so uniquely haunting. This is not a grave that vanished into prehistory before anyone could document it. Alexander's body was fought over. His funerary destiny became entangled with succession struggles, dynastic legitimacy, and the politics of who had the right to claim proximity to his dead greatness. His remains were associated with magnificent transfer, monumental honor, and ultimately with Alexandria, where his tomb appears to have stood as a site of extraordinary prestige. Emperors and rulers reportedly sought it out. To stand near Alexander in death was to stand near one of the most powerful legitimizing forces in the ancient imagination. And yet the tomb that once drew the gaze of the world no longer stands securely before us. The political symbolism behind the loss deepens the darkness rather than resolving it. Alexander was too important ever to become a simple body. His corpse was part of the struggle over empire itself. That means his burial history was always vulnerable to movement, manipulation, appropriation, and later disruption. Dynasties changed, cities shifted, Alexandria suffered damage, rebuilding, religious transformation, urban layering, and the long violence of time. In such conditions, even a tomb of enormous fame could be obscured, dismantled, reburied, or swallowed beneath later structures. That is part of what makes the case so painful to historical imagination. The grave was not lost because no one cared. It was lost despite the fact that nearly everyone cared. What makes Alexander especially deserving of the number 1 spot is the emotional force of proximity. Unlike some other cases that belong mostly to remote legend, Alexander's tomb feels as though it should almost be recoverable. The chain of memory is too strong, the historical figure too central, the reported location too culturally significant. It seems impossible that such a grave could be missing, and that impossibility is exactly what keeps the mystery alive. The tomb hovers just beyond certainty, perhaps beneath modern Alexandria, perhaps destroyed, perhaps folded into ruins not yet fully understood. It is close enough to torment, far enough to remain unsolved. And that is why Alexander the Great's tomb takes the number 1 spot. It is the supreme burial mystery because it combines everything that makes a lost grave irresistible: global historical importance, ancient eyewitness memory, political struggle over the corpse, monumental prestige, urban disappearance, and the unbearable fact that a tomb once visible to the world has become one of archaeology's greatest absences. Alexander conquered so much of the known world that his body seemed destined for immortality in stone. Instead, history misplaced him, and there may be no more haunting fate for a ruler who wanted to be impossible to forget.